Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we're going to be dimming the lights, settling in, and exploring a truly ancient and, frankly, rather uncomfortable concept. We're going to dive into the murky historical waters of something often called droit du seigneur, or jus prime noctis, the right of the first night. Now, before anyone gets too excited or too horrified, let's just gently drift into this topic. It's one of those historical notions that has been exaggerated, romanticized, and sometimes completely fabricated. But the underlying idea, the power dynamic, well, that's what makes it so fascinatingly persistent. So grab your favorite comfy blanket, maybe a cup of herbal tea, and let's just float into the shadows of history. The idea of a powerful lord or ruler claiming the right to sleep with a newly married woman on her wedding night is one that has haunted historical narratives for centuries. It conjures images of tyrannical nobles, terrified peasants, and a profound imbalance of power. But the reality, as is often the case with history, is a little more nuanced, a little less straightforward, and arguably even more subtly insidious in its implications. Let's start by addressing the elephant in the room. Did this actually happen, routinely, as a widespread legal right? The short answer is probably not in the way it's often depicted in movies and novels. The long answer, of course, is where all the fun, or rather the sleep-inducing historical analysis, begins. The term droit du seigneur, which translates quite literally to the right of the Lord, became particularly popular in French literature and historical discussions during the Enlightenment. It was used as a convenient rhetorical device to highlight the supposed barbarity and oppression of feudalism. Think Voltaire, happily penning plays and essays where evil lords exploited their serfs, and this right became a perfect symbol for everything wrong with the old aristocratic order. It was a potent propaganda tool, painting a clear picture of the inherent injustices of a system they were trying to dismantle. Because why not demonize your opponents with a really lurid, easily digestible accusation? However, finding concrete, undeniable legal texts or widespread historical accounts from the actual medieval period that explicitly lay out this right as a routine practice is surprisingly difficult. It's like trying to catch a particularly slippery fish in a very dark pond. There are hints, allusions, and a whole lot of scholarly debate, but a definitive, universally applied law? Not so much. What we do find, though, are a lot of scattered references to customs, fees, and symbolic acts that might have given rise to the legend. And this is where it gets interesting, in that gently meandering historical way. Instead of a direct, I get to sleep with your bride, we often encounter something much more bureaucratic, much more medieval. We see things like a marriage tax or a formarriage fee. Imagine, if you will, a peasant living on a lord's land. This peasant wants to marry someone from outside the lord's immediate domain. Now, from the lord's perspective, this is a problem. You're taking one of my valuable workers, one of my potential future taxpayers, and you're letting them form a bond that might pull them away from my glorious, if slightly muddy, manor. So, what does the lord do? He charges a fee, of course, because why let a good opportunity for revenue slip away? This fee was essentially a payment for the lord's permission to marry, and it helped solidify his control over his tenants' lives, including their most personal decisions. It's a subtle form of control, not a crude assertion of sexual privilege, but a very effective one nonetheless. Now let's drift even further back in time, beyond the well-documented, or rather poorly documented, feudal era. Because the idea of a ruler or a powerful figure having some kind of special access to women, particularly on their wedding night, pops up in much older mythologies and legends. This is where it gets a bit more primal, a bit less about tax revenue and more about raw power and symbolism. Think of ancient creation myths or heroic tales. Often, the king, the priest, or even a deity is depicted as having some kind of special access to the first fruits of everything, the first harvest, the firstborn animal, and, in some interpretations, the first sexual experience of a virgin. This isn't necessarily about a legal rite enforced by a medieval court. It's more about a symbolic offering, a way of acknowledging the ultimate power of the ruler or the divine. For example, in some very ancient societies, there was a belief that the act of defloration itself was dangerous or sacred, and only certain individuals were ritually pure or powerful enough to perform it safely. So the king or the high priest might symbolically, or even actually, perform this act as a way of protecting the marriage or blessing the couple from malevolent spirits. It's less about lust and more about ritual, at least on the surface, though one can imagine how quickly such a ritual could devolve into something far less sacred, given the opportunity. Humans, being humans, often find ways to twist sacred rituals to suit their more earthly desires. Let's consider the Epic of Gilgamesh, for instance, that ancient Mesopotamian tale, one of the oldest surviving works of literature. In it, Gilgamesh, the mighty king of Uruk, is depicted as a powerful, indeed almost tyrannical ruler. The citizens complain about his oppressive rule, and one of their specific grievances is that he does not leave a virgin to her lover, nor the daughter of a warrior, nor the wife of a noble. Now, this sounds a lot like our first night concept, doesn't it? In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the king's behavior is depicted not as a legal entitlement, but as a blatant abuse of power and a sign of absolute dominion over his people. This distinction is vital. The narrative frames his actions as a transgression and an act of tyranny that justifies divine intervention, rather than a standard operating procedure. This context is crucial when examining the historical myth of droit du seigneur. Much of the evidence for such a right stems from literary critiques and later historical dramas, like Beaumarchais' The Marriage of Figaro, where the concept serves as a symbolic tool to condemn aristocratic decadence rather than a reflection of documented legal codes. In reality, the social and economic structures of the Middle Ages offer a more grounded explanation for these legends. Marriage was a contractual agreement involving land, labor, and lineage. Feudal lords often charged fees like for marriage, or the suggestively named collagium, a marriage tax, to compensate for the potential loss of labor when a serf married. Over time, the suggestive terminology of these economic levies likely morphed in the popular imagination into stories of sexual entitlement. Furthermore, symbolic customs like couchage, where a lord might briefly and decorously sit on the marital bed to signify his legal blessing, could easily be misinterpreted by later generations as a more intimate claim. Ultimately, while the right of the Lord is largely a historical fiction, it persists as a powerful narrative because it represents the ultimate fear of unchecked authority and the violation of personal boundaries. It's also worth remembering the sheer lack of privacy that characterized much of pre-modern life, especially for peasants. People lived in small, often one-room dwellings with little personal space. The idea of a private wedding night, free from any outside intrusion or oversight, would have been a luxury rarely afforded. Marriages were communal events, celebrated by the entire village, and the consummation of the marriage, while not necessarily public in a direct visual sense, would have been understood as a community affair, marking the transition of the couple into a new social status. This communal aspect could, in some interpretations, have given rise to the idea that the Lord, as the head of the community, had some kind of symbolic or even actual role in the consummation. Again, it's a slippery slope from symbolic oversight to direct intervention, but the conditions were certainly ripe for such interpretations to emerge and solidify over time into local customs or legends. Let's not forget the sheer power of the church in medieval Europe. The church had a massive influence over marriage laws, deeming it a sacrament and regulating everything from who could marry whom to the very definition of a valid marriage. Interestingly, the church generally opposed any practice that would undermine the sanctity of marriage, and that included any supposed rite of the first night by a secular lord. The church would have seen this as an infringement on its own authority and on the sacrament of marriage itself. So, if this rite were truly widespread and legally recognized, one would expect to see much stronger condemnation and efforts to suppress it from the church. The relative silence from ecclesiastical records on this specific rite, beyond general complaints about lordly abuses, further suggests its rarity as a formal, legally recognized practice. However, the church itself had its own complex relationship with sexuality and power. While it condemned secular lords taking liberties, it often asserted its own forms of control over the sexual lives of its parishioners. For example, the concept of priestly celibacy, while ideologically motivated, also meant that many priests were unmarried, and this created its own set of social dynamics and, unfortunately, abuses of power in some instances. But that's a story for another sleep-inducing monologue. What we are left with regarding droit du seigneur is a fascinating tapestry woven from threads of economic control, social hierarchy, ancient ritual, literary invention, and the enduring human fascination with power and its abuse. It's a concept that is more potent in its symbolic form than in its historical reality, acting as a powerful mirror reflecting the anxieties and grievances of different eras. The historical study of droit du seigneur serves as a gentle reminder that history is rarely as straightforward as we might wish. It's filled with ambiguities, contested narratives, and the constant interplay between fact and legend. And sometimes the legends tell us more about the people who created and perpetuated them than about the actual events they purport to describe. They speak to fears, desires, and the eternal struggle for power and dignity. So, as we slowly drift towards the end of this first part, let's just ponder on the idea that even the most sensational historical claims often have much more mundane, bureaucratic, or even symbolic origins. The image of the Lord claiming his first night is a powerful one, almost archetypal in its representation of tyranny. But beneath that dramatic surface lies a much more complex historical reality, filled with tax receipts, social customs, and the quiet anxieties of those living under the thumb of power. And with that, we'll gently pause our journey for tonight, ready to float into the next chapter of historical oddities. Sweet dreams, everyone! So let's pick up right where we left off, drifting back into that hazy space where legal taxes meet legendary terrors. If you're still awake, just sink a little deeper into your pillows. We were talking about how a buttock tax, the lovely collagium, could eventually be misinterpreted as a literal demand for a bride. And really, isn't that just peak human nature, taking a boring administrative fee and turning it into a scandalous plot point for a future Netflix period drama? To truly understand why this myth of the first night wouldn't die, we have to look at the people who actually sat down and wrote about it. Because, as it turns out, these sleepless historians of the medieval and Renaissance world were just as prone to a bit of sensationalism as anyone else. Take, for instance, some of the early legal scholars in the 14th and 15th centuries. Now, these guys weren't necessarily trying to document a crime, they were trying to justify why a lord had the right to collect money. They would look at these ancient fees, the ones paid when a peasant girl married outside the manor, and they'd start to speculate. They'd say things like, well, the lord could have claimed the bride, but out of the goodness of his heart and his Christian piety, he's letting her off the hook for a modest sum of silver. It's the ultimate, I'm not robbing you, I'm giving you a discount on your own dignity move. By framing the tax as a commutation, a replacement for a physical act, the lawyers essentially created the legal ghost of the first night. They made it seem like the right existed just so they could prove the tax was a bargain. It's like a car dealership telling you they could charge you for the air and the tires, but they're giving it to you for free if you just pay the wheel maintenance fee. Of course, everyone focuses on the air, not the fee. And then we have to talk about the Scottish, because if there's one place where the legend of the first night really dug its heels in, it's the rugged, misty Highlands. There's a persistent story about a King Evenus III of Scotland, who supposedly made the Jus Primae Noctis a formal law way back in the 1st century BC. Now, Evenus III is about as real as a unicorn in a kilt. He's a legendary figure, likely cooked up by later chroniclers like Hector Bos in the 1520s. Bos was a bit of a creative writer, let's say. He wanted to paint the ancient kings of Scotland as pagan barbarians so that the later Christian kings looked much better by comparison. So he gives Evenus this law: the Lord of the ground shall have the maidenhead of all virgins dwelling on the same. It's a classic look how far we've come narrative. Sure, your current king is taxing your sheep, but at least he isn't Evenus III, right? It was a way to make the present misery feel a bit more palatable by inventing a much more lurid past. And because it was written down in a history book, people believed it for centuries. It even made its way into Braveheart, because why let historical accuracy get in the way of a good freedom speech and a dramatic reason to start a rebellion? But let's pivot away from the fake kings and look at the real, awkward social dynamics of a medieval village. Think about the wedding visit. In many rural parts of Europe, it was a common custom for the local lord to actually attend the wedding feast of his higher-ranking tenants. Now, imagine you're a peasant. You're having the biggest party of your life. There's ale, there's dancing, and suddenly the guy who literally owns your house walks in. The music probably stops for a second, right? But the Lord isn't there to be a buzzkill. He's there to show largesse. He brings a gift, maybe a jug of better wine, and he sits at the head of the table. As the night goes on and the ale continues to flow, things get traditional. There was often a ritual where the Lord would be the one to lead the bride to the bridal chamber, or perhaps he'd be the one to place the first foot on the bed. In some places, he might even sit on the edge of the bed for a moment while the couple was tucked in by the village elders. To a modern eye, this is incredibly weird and intrusive, but to them, it was a symbolic passing of the torch. The woman was moving from the protection of her father and her lord into the protection of her husband. The Lord's presence was a stamp of approval. But you can see how easily a disgruntled villager or a traveler from another town could see the Lord disappearing into a room with a bride and think, wait, is he doing what I think he's doing? Misunderstanding a ritual is practically a human pastime. And then we have to talk about the marriage of the dead, or ghost marriages in some even older contexts, where a ruler might symbolically marry a deceased woman to ensure her soul was looked after. The right to a woman wasn't always about the physical body. It was often about the spiritual or legal ownership of her status. In the eyes of the law, a woman was often seen as a piece of property that generated more property, children. The first night was, in a very dry and depressing way, an audit. The Lord was checking his inventory. Let's drift into the psychological side of this for a moment. Why does this specific myth, the idea of the virgin's debt, remain so popular in our collective memory? I think it's because it represents the ultimate fear of the other. If you're a common person, the nobility doesn't just feel like a different social class, it feels like a different species. They have different clothes, different food, and they speak a different version of the language. They have the power of life and death. If they can take your grain and your sons for their wars, the logical and terrifying next step is that they can take your intimacy too. The droit du seigneur is the ultimate final boss of exploitation. It's the idea that there is no part of your life, not even your wedding night, that is truly yours. Even if it never happened as a law, the fact that people believed it could happen tells us everything we need to know about how terrifyingly absolute the power of the medieval elite felt to those living under it. It's also a very male myth, isn't it? If you look at the stories, the focus is almost always on the husband's honor being insulted or the father's property being damaged. The woman herself is often just a plot device, a maiden to be saved or a victim to be avenged. It's a way for men to talk about their own powerlessness in the face of a higher-ranking man. He can take my wife is the ultimate, I'm not the master of my own house. But let's not get too heavy. Let's float back to some of the weirder, more specific taxes that actually existed, which might have fueled the fire. In some parts of Germany, there was a custom called Besthaupt, or best head. When a tenant died, the lord had the right to claim the best thing the tenant owned. Usually, this was a cow or a horse, but if the tenant was particularly poor, the best thing might be something else. Now, apply this logic to a wedding. If the lord has the right to the best of everything, and a virginity is prized as the best or most valuable asset of a bride, well, you don't need a law degree to see where the village gossip goes with that. The lord took my best cow last year, surely he'll want the best of my daughter this year. It's a grim kind of peasant humor, a way of venting frustration through dark irony. And as the centuries passed, that dark irony curdled into what we now think of as a historical fact. And then there's also the role of the merchant. This was a fine paid specifically by unfree tenants, serfs, to their lord when their daughters married. We have thousands of records of merchant payments. They are boring, they are repetitive, and they are everywhere in English manorial records. Alice, daughter of John, pays 2 shillings for permission to marry, or Joan pays a capon, a chicken, to marry the smith. It's about as sexy as a spreadsheet, but for the people paying it, it was a reminder that their very bloodline was subject to the Lord's ledger. If you couldn't afford the 2 shillings, you couldn't get married. In a way, the Lord was in the bedroom with you, because he was the one who decided if the bedroom was legally allowed to exist in the first place. So when we see movies like Braveheart, where the English lords are riding around snatching up Scottish brides, we have to remember that's the action movie version of a tax audit. The real horror wasn't a sudden raid on a wedding, it was the slow, grinding realization that you had to save up for 3 years just to get the lord's signature on a piece of parchment so you could move in with your partner. And honestly, which is more sleep-inducing, a dramatic kidnapping or a 400-year history of marriage permit fees? I think we know the answer. Let's take a moment to consider the handsome monarchs and the mad kings who might have actually tried to pull this off, even without a law. Because while the law didn't exist, bad people certainly did. Think of someone like King John of England, the one from the Robin Hood stories. He wasn't exactly known for his boundaries. He spent a lot of time visiting the wives of his noblemen while the noblemen were off at war. He didn't need a right of the first night because he had the right of being the king and having a lot of guards. When a king or a high-ranking lord behaved like this, it wasn't seen as a custom, it was seen as a scandal. It was one of the reasons the barons eventually forced him to sign the Magna Carta. They weren't just fighting for liberty, they were fighting to keep the king away from their families and their wallets. So, in a weird twist, the absence of the first night in legal codes actually proves how much people hated the idea. Whenever a ruler tried to act like the myth, his subjects eventually rose up and handed him a long, very boring legal document to sign, essentially telling him, "So let's settle into the final stretch of our journey," perhaps pulling the blankets up just a little higher as we drift through the last remnants of this historical fog. We've looked at the fake kings, the real tax collectors, and the buttock taxes that somehow turned into legends of aristocratic predation. But to wrap this up, we have to look at how this phantom right finally faded away, or rather, how it evolved into something even more awkward and bureaucratic. Because history rarely ends with a bang, it usually ends with a very long, very quiet sigh and a stack of paperwork. As we move into the late Renaissance and the early modern period, the droit du premier night underwent a strange transformation. It stopped being a source of terror and started becoming a joke, a bit of dry, cynical humor used by the very people who were supposed to be its victims. By the 16th and 17th centuries, the fees we talked about earlier, those merceds and foremarriages, were being phased out. But because the aristocracy never liked giving up a source of income, they didn't just disappear. They were rebranded. In many parts of Europe, the virgin's debt became a wedding present that the peasant was honored to give to the lord. Imagine the irony. Instead of the lord claiming a right over the bride, the couple was now expected to bring a gift to the manor house to thank the lord for letting them get married on his land. It was essentially the same tax, just with better PR. Oh no, it's not a permission fee, it's a voluntary donation to the Lord's wine cellar fund. Of course, if you didn't voluntarily donate, your life on the farm became very difficult very quickly. This era also saw the rise of the mock droit du seigneur. In some German and French villages, a tradition developed where the local lord would show up at the wedding, demand his right, and the groom would then buy him off with a massive ham or a particularly large cask of beer. It became a piece of village theater, a way for the community to acknowledge the old scary stories while asserting that in the modern world, a good piece of smoked pork was much more valuable than a medieval legend. It's actually quite a cozy image if you think about it. The lord and the peasants all playing their roles in a script that everyone knows is fake, just so they can all get on with the business of drinking and dancing. It turned a symbol of absolute tyranny into a transactional comedy. But while the peasants were turning the myth into a joke, the intellectuals were doing something much more permanent. We touched on this with Voltaire and the Enlightenment, but it's worth sinking into for a moment longer. These writers weren't just using the droit du premier night to attack the monarchy. They were using it to define what it meant to be civilized. By writing about the right of the first night as a real historical fact, they created a dark mirror for their own time. They could look at their own society, which was still full of poverty, inequality, and systemic abuse, and say, well, at least we don't have that anymore. It was a way of creating a sense of progress. If you can invent a sufficiently monstrous past, the present always looks like a golden age of enlightenment. It's a bit like us looking back at the Victorians and their weird medical practices. It makes us feel superior, even if we're just as prone to our own modern absurdities. The sleepless historians of the 1700s were the masters of this. They took the scattered, muddy records of the Middle Ages and polished them into a narrative of darkness that they had supposedly escaped. And then, of course, there's the final resting place of the Virgin's debt, the Victorian era. The Victorians were obsessed with two things, morality and the Middle Ages. When they looked at the legend of the first night, they were both horrified and secretly fascinated. They wrote massive, multi-volume histories of human barbarity, dedicating hundreds of pages to analyzing whether ancient Celts or Germanic tribes practiced this rite. This is where the term jus prime noctis really became a staple of the history books. It sounded academic, it sounded official, it sounded like something that must have been a law because it had a Latin name. But the more they looked for it, the more it slipped through their fingers. They found stories, they found poems, and they found plenty of taxes, but they never found the smoking gun. Yet they kept it in the textbooks. Why? Because it was a great story. It sold books. It made for dramatic paintings. It gave the Victorian gentleman a reason to huff into his mustache and talk about the sanctity of the home, while ignoring the fact that his own factory workers were living in conditions that would have made a medieval serf weep with pity. As we reach the end of our monologue, we have to ask, what is the Virgin's debt today? In a way, it lives on in our obsession with royal drama. We still love the idea of the powerful elite having different rules than the rest of us. We still look at the handsome kings and the tragic queens and imagine their lives were filled with these bizarre, archaic rituals. We want history to be stranger than the present. We want it to be more colorful, more dangerous, and a little bit more scandalous. But the truth, the slow, sleepy, bureaucratic truth, is that the rite of the first night was never about a single night. It was about every day. It was the right of the Lord to your grain, your labor, your taxes, and your loyalty. The first night was just the most dramatic way to describe a system where your body and your future belonged to someone else by virtue of their birth. The real debt wasn't a biological one, it was a social one. It was the debt of being born into a world that had already decided your value based on the land you stood on. So, as you drift off to sleep, you can rest easy knowing that King Evenus III never actually signed that law, and the local baron probably didn't show up at weddings to do anything more than drink too much of the groom's wine and tell bad jokes about his sheep. The monsters of the past were often just men with very long ledgers and a very high opinion of their own importance. The lights are low now. The stories of the first night are just echoes in the dark, as thin and insubstantial as the ink on a 700-year-old tax receipt. The kings are gone, the lords are memories, and the only debt you have tonight is to the pillow beneath your head. We've floated through the myths, the taxes, and the fake laws. We've seen how a buttock tax can travel through 1,000 years of gossip to become a Hollywood plot point. And honestly, isn't that just the most human thing imaginable? We'd rather believe in a grand, dramatic tragedy than a boring, repetitive fee. But tonight, the boring version is the one that brings us peace. No drama, no scandals, just the quiet, rhythmic ticking of history as it moves from one ledger to the next. Sleep well.